So we're with Dr. Richard Ladner, and he's at the University of Washington. Richard, could you just introduce yourself and some of the work that you're involved in?
Yeah, I'm a professor at the University of Washington. This is actually my 44th year, hard to believe, that I've been here this long. And for the last roughly 10 years, I've really been focusing a lot on broadening participation in K through 12 education, and as well as doing my own research with my graduate students in accessibility. So 10 years ago, Cheryl Bergstaller and I, Cheryl is the director of the Do It Center at the University of Washington, and she's been doing that for over 20 years. So it's a really exciting center that is promoting and helping students with disabilities, mostly at the college level. Although some at K through 12, they have a great summer program that's been going on since 1994 for approximately 20 to 30 disabled high school students, sort of preparing them for the college. And I've been associated with that summer program for 10 years. I did a project with about 5 to 6 students every year from about 1995 to 2005. Teaching them computer science for a week, and that was a lot of fun. And of course, we developed a lot of our own stuff at that time. There wasn't a lot of great stuff out like Scratch and Alice and all the great tools that are out right now. We had to develop our own. Mm-hmm. So I have a lot of background with students with disability. I should add one more thing, though, that disability is part of the fabric of my life. My parents were deaf. I grew up in a deaf family. I knew lots of deaf people. I still know lots of deaf people. I know sign language. And through the process of that, I met a lot of deaf blind people. And then I got interested in blind as well as deaf. So I really, that's sort of my focus. And then just recently, in the last year, we have a new faculty member here at the University of Washington, Meyer Kakmak, who does robotics. And she's really interested in assistive robotics. Working with people with mobility disabilities and making their lives easier. So I think, it's just something I really like to do. Now, Cheryl and I have this NSF Broadening Participation Alliance called Access Computing. And we're actually just beginning our 10th year of that, funded by National Science Foundation of 3 separate grants. And we're going to be applying for extension. See if we can continue, and we'll see what they say. And that project, we have about 35 partners around the country, and we work with our partners both at other broadening participation groups plus institutions to make it enabling more students with disabilities to get into computing fields. Almost all our partners deal with college level, but some deal with younger kids as well. And then just this year, Cheryl and I and another colleague from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, Andreas Stefik, put together a grant to work specifically with the K through 12 efforts that are going on, the national efforts, the CS10K effort that was started, 5 or 6 years ago, to help all those projects do a better job of training teachers so that the teachers are prepared to have students with disabilities in their classrooms and giving them resources so that when a student comes into their class that has a disability, say, a blind student, they don't throw up their hand and say, well, we can't take that student. We're not ready for that student. And so we want to change that so that when that student arrives, wants to take the computer science class, the teacher will say, oh, I know what to do. Here are some resources I can use. So that's what we want to do, is sort of change the landscape of preparing teachers to include all the students. And, this would be true for other areas like around the country in high schools, like in big cities like Seattle. I think in Seattle we have over 40 different languages that are spoken. And these students should have ability to take computer science as well. So it's not just disability, but it's just the broad diversity. Computer science has done a great job in attracting women into computing. Maybe the numbers aren't there, but the effort is there. And I think that we want to make sure that we broaden that to everyone, and not just to to women, to all sort of groups that are underrepresented and could really benefit the whole enterprise of computer science. There is no single definition of disability. But in the United States, we have the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, IDEA, that actually goes back to the 1970s with Public Law 94-142, which is the original legislation. And in that legislation, public education is supposed to include all students with disabilities. So I'm just looking at a sheet here. I pulled that down from the Center for Education Statistics about students with disabilities under IDEA. And currently in the United States, there are about 50 million K-12 students, and 13% of them, which is about 6.5 million, are under IDEA. That is, they have an individualized education plan. That their plan for education might be slightly different than the standard student in a high school. That's a big number, 6 million, 6.5 million. So we don't want to leave these people out. And of course, they're there are lots of different kinds of disabilities. They list here autism, approximately 400,000. Now, some of these students that have autism, they might have mild autism. They might be intellectually capable. They could be computer scientists. In fact, my guess is there's plenty of autistic computer scientists. So we don't want to rule that group out. There are students who are, it's another group, learning disabilities, almost 2.4 million in the United States. And those students might simply have dyslexia, or they might have some reading difficulties, or whatever it is. And they might actually be very intellectually strong, but they just have some gaps that need to be filled or can be filled. And so they could be computer scientists. So the point is, of this 6.5 million students with disabilities, a very large number of them, I don't know the percentage. My guess is, and I think if I read the literature correctly, about 50% are certainly capable of doing college work. Yeah. So it's not, all these students are headed for vocational training or something like that. So the different disabilities, I mentioned autism, deaf-blindness, developmental delay. I'm not sure that could include something like cerebral palsy. I'm not sure what some of these things include. Hearing impairments, and so on. Multiple disabilities. I know a lot of people like that. Orthopedic impediments, other health impairments. Learning disabilities is the biggest group. Speech and language impairments, and visual impairments. So it covers a lot of ground. I should say that a few of these groups, of course, I have a strong affinity for deaf and blind, as I mentioned earlier, that the access is a big issue. Access to the information, access to the products, the tools, and the curricula are a big issue for blind and for deaf. So I think that's, and a lot of our project is going to be working on making sure that for example, the programming tools that are available for teachers are, at least some of them, are accessible to blind students. So I think that's kind of the population that we're working with. Just yesterday, I did an hour of code with a deaf program at a local high school here. There were about 25 deaf students there. And that was a kick. And they were really engaged in the whole hour. They wanted to go further than the hour. And many of them saved their work so they could do it at home. So it's kind of exciting to see these kids, getting engaged. And at that meeting, we had a very qualified sign language interpreter who could help make sure that communication was clear. The teachers themselves, luckily in that group, were sign language fluent, and so it all worked out very, very smoothly.
So how that communication, so I'm trying to kind of visualize what that's like. You're in a room with the kids, they're at computers, and then the adults that are sign language fluent are helping to give overall instructions, or like what did it look like in terms of the flow for that activity?
Oh, that's a good question. So for the hour of code, it's the students basically working on their own and just getting some guidance.
Mm-hmm.
I brought 2 of my graduate students with me.
Mm-hmm.
Neither of them were fluent in sign language. So they were actually, of course, I'm fluent in sign language, but I didn't really use it that much. I used speech because I had the sign language interpreter there. Mm-hmm. And so at the very beginning, there was maybe a minute or 2 of instruction, and the sign language interpreter stood by me and signed everybody, and they looked at the sign language interpreter, and I got them started, and they worked on different activities in the hour of code, and then we would go around the room and see what they're doing, and they would raise their hand if they had a question, and it was pretty amazing to me that they didn't have that many questions. They really just moved on. There were these 3 girls that worked together, that decided to work together, and they were doing a scratch, Christmas card, animated Christmas card. Mm-hmm. And that was kind of fun to watch them because they were, signing to each other, trying to make decisions. They, I told them, that there's a saying, there's too many cooks spoil the broth. I don't know if they got that analogy, but their progress was a little bit slow at the beginning, but eventually they got it. And they were able to, I don't know if you know about Scratch, but they were able to create a bunch of sprites that were snowflakes and had them fall. And they had to figure out how to make them fall down instead of to the right or to the left because that's think of the angle. And so it's kind of fun to watch them develop their business card. And they had something working at the end. It was not perfect, but the snow was falling, if you like.
That's one thing that we really try and emphasize is pair programming. And so, and it's good to hear. I mean, in that case, it was 3, but is that something that you've also seen with these kinds of projects, is to kind of also have that pair programming experience for kids?
Yes, and the answer is yes. For 3 years, I had a Saturday program, again with deaf kids, and many of them were from this high school, actually. Mm-hmm. And the way I set that up, and this is from my experience many years ago when I worked with the Do It summer program, that I got volunteers, mostly undergraduates and graduate students, to come with me, and so we had pretty much a one-to-one student, and these were all deaf students, student plus one of our students. So it wasn't like they were equivalent, but the rule was that the student who was very knowledgeable would never take the keyboard, would go on a mouse, and would, they would use mostly writing on paper to explain things and stuff like that, because they didn't have full communication. But we did have a sign language interpreter in the room, but they can't be at every conversation. Yeah. So we have done a lot, and I think that's really successful. And the projects that come out of these situations are typically more sophisticated, and the students get a little more, how can I put it, they were doing Scratch and Arduino and processing. Those are the different things we had done. But what they come out of it is something they can be proud of. It's more polished than if they'd just done it by themselves, because they have that expert beside them, and the expert didn't take over, so they felt ownership of the project in the end. And also, I'm a strong advocate of project-oriented work as opposed to just straight curricula. And it's good to see that the Computer Science Principles is emphasizing that project by having the portfolio. I think that's a big plus, because in the end, the student will have something that they've built themselves, and in the process of, and that motivates to build something good. In the process, they will have to learn computer science principles, and so on. They can't just hack it away. They'll really need to do a deeper thought about their projects.
As a teacher, that is new to computer science. Maybe not new to education, but that's often some of our people they're educators, but maybe new to computer science. And so what are some resources that these teachers could access and be aware of as they, kind of have a different scenario in their room of computers? Maybe some of them have figured out how to deal with lab equipment or manipulatives, but they haven't really thought about the computering.
But there is this issue of, that I've discovered is that last year when we did the hour of code, not one of those activities was accessible to a blind user. Okay. None of them. Scratch is not accessible. So basically, blind children have been left out of all the efforts that have gone on so far in creating tools and curricula for young people. And we're beginning to change that now. There's a person, Stephanie Ludi, at Rochester Institute of Technology, who has created some curricula for the ECS. That she's actually low vision or blind herself, and so she has some personal stake in this. There's also, I mentioned earlier, Andreas Stefik, who is at the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, and he's developed the language called Quorum, Quorum, and that actually is now an activity on the Hour of Code. And I looked yesterday, and it was about 6,000 people had done it so far. And I'm hoping that some of those are blind people, not just, anybody can do it, of course. And of course, we'll never know exactly. Maybe just by asking people or surveying, we'll find out if they did that. So for the first time, an Hour of Code has at least one, in fact, only one activity that's accessible, programming activity that's accessible for blind kids. So, and I think this is the most difficult group among all with disabilities to include in computer science. And starting off with the drag and drop model of programming, which is so successful, was a big impediment for just everybody got on board on that, and turned out to be an avenue that doesn't lead to an accessible way of learning or teaching programming. And if you think about it, the original ways we taught programming, which was text, is accessible. So we kind of took a step backwards in doing the drag and drop model for programming in terms of accessibility. Now, of course, it's very attractive to women. It's very attractive to other groups. So we don't want to get rid of it, but we just want to make sure there's alternatives to that. It turned out that some of these drag and drop languages, just the act of dragging and dropping cannot be done by people with cerebral palsy. They are not that accurate. And you have to place those blocks exactly where they are. But people with cerebral palsy or with other disabilities that don't allow them to move their arms very smoothly and very accurately, they've been doing text entry for a long time, so they could do text entry too. So it's not just blind. It's a lot of these drag and drop or blocks tools are just, they're not that great for people with disabilities, either mobility or blind. I want to add one more thing about Code.org that I thought was really kind of exciting. When Code.org started in 2013, it's hard to believe it's just last year, I know. And they put out this wonderful video with, all these big name people on it. And we loved the video. It was really exciting to see, Chris Bosch and all these people. I can't remember all the people that were on there. Mark Zuckerberg, Bill Gates, and so on, touting that they were once novice programmers themselves and they couldn't do anything, and they had to get started. But the whole video was not captioned, so deaf kids could not appreciate that video because they didn't know what they were saying. And so I contacted Code.org and said, well, I think maybe you want to make this open for everybody. So within 24 hours, they had the thing captioned in English and Spanish.
Wow.
So, that's a huge commitment to broadening participation that Code.org did. So from then on, I've been a big supporter of Code.org. They really responded. They didn't quite get it right at the very beginning, but they turned it around so quickly
Right.
that it really was amazing.
Do you find yourself often in that advocacy role?
It's not that people have bad hearts, that they're evil, but it's just that they just overlook it. And so I'm very happy to remind them that there are these other people in the world that they should also be considering. And what's really beautiful about also ECS, exploring computer science, and Jane Margolis and Gail Chapman and Joanna Goody, they are really, ECS is built on top of broadening participation in a sense. They want everybody to participate. That's the whole goal of that thing. Mm-hmm. And they started in the Los Angeles School District, and a vast, I think the majority of the students were Hispanic, for example, that did ECS in the beginning. And it's expanded. But in talking to them over the last few years, they want to include students with disabilities too. And so we're working with them to help them with their curriculum to improve it. I mentioned Stephanie Moody earlier has already developed some curricula. It's not been used to my knowledge yet. And by the way, these curricula that we're suggesting can be used by everybody. They're not just for blind kids. Just they're accessible. Blind kid can use a screen reader to access the information, to input the information they need to create a program, and so on. So yeah, I end up being an advocate a lot, but it's fun. I think people have, like I said, usually have good hearts, and they want to do the right thing, and it's not like there's huge resistance. It's just lack of knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so my aha moment that I described in there was back in the early 1980s when one of our graduate students here at the University of Washington, who was blind, has got very low vision, came to me with a project, as he knew I was kind of interested in. And to make a display in large print display for Unix, and he built it, And so the aha moment was, here was this guy who was blind, who could build software and solve his own accessibility problem, because now he could read the screen much more easily than he could before without the enlargement. So that sort of set me on a path, that to help people realize that people with disabilities are not just to be accommodated, but they can actually change the field. They can make it better, the whole field better, not just for themselves, but for everybody. And so, it's the same thing with diversity. We want to have a diverse computing population, people that can do engineering, build programs, do design, and so forth, because, the people who are going to use all these products are a diverse set. And so you don't get that creativity by just having sort of a uniform set of engineers. You need this cross-section. So that put me on that path toward access computing and so on, and doing all the things I've done, realizing that it's not just, it's for us that we're bringing in people with disabilities. They're going to invent things that they need and that we need. Mm-hmm. One of the early examples of this that I only realized later was a big deal was the TTY, which was used by deaf people for many years to communicate over phone lines using typing. So the deaf people were doing personal texting long before we were doing it, hearing people. Well, the guy that invented the modem to make that possible was a deaf guy, because he wanted to be able to use the phone. I think we need these people to be the innovators, because they have these life experiences that we don't have. And so they will come up with things that we don't come up with. And we don't want to be paternalistic. We don't want to say, well, we know the best way. We want to include these people and make sure that they have the power to create the technology themselves.